The Whistling Man. Sarah had always been a light sleeper, but lately, her insomnia had reached new heights. Every night, around 3 a.m., she'd hear a faint whistling outside her window. At first, she dismissed it as the wind or a nocturnal bird. But as the nights wore on, the tune became more distinct, more deliberate. One particularly restless night, Sarah crept to her window, determined to catch a glimpse of the mysterious whistler. As she peered through the curtains, her blood ran cold. There, standing beneath the streetlight, was a tall, gaunt figure. Its face was hidden in shadow, but Sarah could make out its unnaturally long, spindly fingers tapping against its leg in time with the eerie melody. The figure suddenly stopped whistling and turned its head towards Sarah's window. She ducked down, heart pounding. When she finally gathered the courage to look again, the street was empty. The next day, Sarah confided in her neighbor, Mrs. Johnson. The old woman's face paled as Sarah described the whistling man. "My dear," Mrs. Johnson whispered, "my grandmother used to tell stories about him. They say he only appears to those marked for death." That night, Sarah lay awake, ears straining for any sound. The silence was deafening. Just as she began to relax, thinking perhaps it had all been in her head, she heard it. The whistling. But this time it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside her house. Sarah's heart raced as she heard slow, deliberate footsteps climbing the stairs. The whistling grew louder, closer. She wanted to run, to scream, but fear paralyzed her. The doorknob to her bedroom slowly began to turn. As the door creaked open, Sarah caught a glimpse of long, spindly fingers wrapping around the edge. The whistling stopped, replaced by raspy breathing. Sarah squeezed her eyes shut. The Mirror's Secret. James inherited his grandmother's Victorian mansion with mixed emotions. While he appreciated the historical value, the house had always given him the creeps as a child, especially the ornate, full-length mirror in the master bedroom. As James settled in, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He'd catch glimpses of movement in the mirror's reflection, only to turn and find an empty room. At night, he'd wake to the sound of whispers, seeming to emanate from behind the glass. Determined to rid himself of the mirror, James attempted to remove it from the wall. To his shock, it wouldn't budge. The frame seemed to be fused to the wall itself. In frustration, he struck the glass with a hammer. The mirror didn't even crack. That night, James woke to find his reflection staring back at him from the foot of his bed. But this wasn't his reflection. It smiled malevolently as James recoiled in terror. The figure stepped out of the mirror frame, its movements jerky and unnatural. As it approached, James noticed subtle differences. This version of him had slightly longer fingers, eyes a shade too dark, and teeth just a bit too sharp. James scrambled out of bed, but his doppelganger was faster, grabbing him with inhuman strength. "You shouldn't have tried to get rid of us," it hissed in James' voice. "Now we need a replacement." James fought, but it was futile. The creature dragged him towards the mirror. The glass rippled like water as James was forced through. He found himself in a twisted version of his bedroom, everything slightly wrong. In the real world, his doppelganger smiled, adjusting its clothes. "Enjoy your new home," it said, its form shifting subtly to match James perfectly. "We've been waiting centuries for a new victim." As the creature that now wore his face turned away, James pounded on the glass, screaming silently. But in this mirror world, no one could hear him. And as he looked around, he realized he wasn't alone. Dozens of pale, gaunt faces stared back at him from the shadows, their eyes filled with centuries of despair. The lonely road. Mike cursed his luck as his car sputtered to a stop on the deserted country road. No cell signal, miles from the nearest town, and a storm brewing on the horizon. As the first drops of rain fell, he spotted a faint light in the distance. Hoping for help, Mike started walking. The light came from an old farmhouse, paint peeling and shutters hanging askew. Mike's knocks went unanswered, but the door swung open at his touch. "Hello?" he called, stepping inside. The interior was dusty, clearly long abandoned. But on the kitchen table sat a steaming cup of coffee and a plate of fresh cookies. Confused, Mike turned to leave, only to find the door had vanished, replaced by solid wall. Panic rising, he ran from room to room, finding no exits. The windows showed only impenetrable darkness beyond. A child's laughter echoed from upstairs. Mike climbed the creaking steps, following the sound to a closed door. Inside, he found a young girl in an old-fashioned dress, playing with a doll. She looked up, smiling. "You're just in time for the tea party," she said, her voice oddly distorted. Backing away, Mike stumbled into something solid. Turning, he came face to face with a towering figure in a black suit, its face a blank white mask. "We've been waiting for you," it said, voice like grinding metal. Mike ran, but each room now held a new horror. A woman in a blood-stained wedding dress. A man with too many teeth and fingers. Creatures that defied description, all reaching for him with hungry eyes. Finally, Mike found himself back in the kitchen. The cup of coffee still steamed, the cookies untouched. A note had appeared next to them. "Eat, drink, and join us. It's the only way out." Mike sank to the floor, realizing the true nature of his prison. Outside, on the lonely road, his abandoned car was already being reclaimed by the encroaching forest. And in the distance, another faint light flickered on, waiting for the next unlucky traveler. The hungry earth. Dr. Emily Chun couldn't believe her luck. After years of searching, she'd finally found it, the lost colony of Roanoke. As her team excavated the site, they uncovered artifacts that would rewrite history. But with each layer they dug, a sense of unease grew. The soil was unusually warm, almost pulsing beneath their feet. Workers complained of whispers at the edge of hearing, of shadows moving in their peripheral vision. Emily dismissed their concerns, too focused on the discovery of a lifetime. Then the disappearances began. First, it was equipment, shovels and picks vanishing when backs were turned. Then a graduate student failed to return from a perimeter check. Search parties found no trace. As panic spread through the camp, Emily refused to halt the dig. They were too close to answers. In her tent one night, poring over maps, she felt the ground shift beneath her. A hand, desiccated and covered in dirt, burst from the earth, grabbing her ankle. Emily screamed, kicking free and running outside. To her horror, the entire campsite was in chaos. The ground rippled like waves, disgorging rotting corpses in ancient, tattered clothes. Her team was being dragged down into the hungry earth. Their screams muffled as soil filled their mouths. Emily ran for the cars, but the earth split open before her, a gaping maw ready to swallow her whole. As she teetered on the edge, a voice seemed to rise from the depths. "Join us. Share our fate." In that moment, Emily understood. The lost colony hadn't disappeared. They'd been taken, absorbed by something ancient and patient. And now, that same force had awakened, hungry for new victims. As the ground gave way beneath her, Emily's last thought was of the irony. She'd wanted to solve the mystery of Roanoke. Instead, she'd become part of it. Days later, when the authorities finally arrived at the now-silent excavation site, they found no bodies, no equipment, no sign of the research team. Only a patch of earth that felt oddly warm to the touch, and the faint sound of whispers carried on the wind.